Good evening, everyone. Today is May 24th. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Listen and Learn podcast. Scott Rustroltz here. Really, four stories I want to focus on today. First being this afternoon, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that scores and essentially estimates the financial impact of major congressional bills, came out with its judgment on the House healthcare bill. First of all, under 23 million people, fewer people will have coverage than the current law assumption from the CBO. Key point that's in 10 years. I want to make is that some outlets are saying that 23 million people will lose health care. That's not quite right because the CBO assumes that 10 million more people than currently are signed up for Obamacare will choose to sign up due to the individual mandate. So essentially what they're saying is those 10 million people who don't want health care but would be forced into it no longer will get it, plus another 10 million who currently have health care would not have it. Now, the CBO does very good work on estimating taxes, estimating spending, but their record on Obamacare in particular is quite poor. And that's where I want to show you this chart, which is their historical predictions of how many people are going to sign up for health insurance. So back in 2014, they were predicting 25 million people would be signing up for the Obamacare exchanges. In reality, we're only at about 12 million. So they were off by more than half. Point being that the CBO has structurally had this bias in their model, and it's not an intentional bias, it's just not, for whatever reason, not capturing what happens in reality appropriately, overestimates the impact of how many people will get health care under Obamacare. So you have to view with some skepticism their healthcare projections. And my guess is that the actual deviation in the number of people who'd have insurance under the healthcare law passed by Republicans in the House and the current Obamacare is not nearly that big, particularly when you consider how many health insurance companies are running out of individual markets. You're going to have dozens of counties next year where you'll have no insurer. Over a third of counties likely next year you'll only have one insurer. So with more and more insurers leaving the individual market, it's highly unlikely you'd see 10 million new people sign on who haven't signed on already. What else they said is that they will save about $119 billion off the budget deficit for the next 10 years. That was very important, is for the Senate to take it up. It did have to cut the deficit, and it will start lowering premiums in 2020 when it's fully phased in. So you will actually cut premiums. That said, there are changes the Senate has to make and will make if they're to get 50 votes. Most notably, I think you should look for a slower phase out of Medicaid because you have Republicans in Medicaid expanding states like Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Shelley Moore Caputo of West Virginia, who need to see higher Medicaid spending. You also see them raise the subsidies for those over the ages of 45 and those making under 50,000 to ensure no one sees this big spike in premiums. It's still going to be tough. The Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is out there saying it'll be tough to get to 50 votes, plus Pence being the 51st. You only have 2 votes to spare. In all likelihood, I think you have to assume the Maine Senator, Susan Collins, will vote against it, so you really can only lose one more vote. But at the end of the day, this was a 7-year promise for Republicans, and I think as in the House you saw when they failed to vote the first time, a visceral response from voters who said, how could you not pass a bill? You were promising to repeal this for 7 years. That's why you got into office. And hopefully that political pressure transfers over to the Senate. They make some necessary changes to ensure that older Americans don't see a spike in premiums. And then from there, it goes back to the House where presumably it would pass. So that's kind of what's going on with healthcare at the moment. Second point I want to follow up from yesterday was on the Trump budget. You're seeing many people say that you're not going, the Trump's plan for 7%, 3% GDP growth over 7 years is unrealistic. And I really want to push back on that and bring us this chart here, which is looking at 7-year trailing GDP figures. And what you notice is we've consistently achieved 3% higher growth. So from 1987, the 7-year trailing, which essentially means 1980 to 1987, the Reagan presidency, up through 1990. So from 1980 to 1990, we averaged over 3%. From starting 7-year trailing in 1998, which really begins in 1991, so 1991 up through 2004, you saw 3% GDP growth. So are you really saying that we can't achieve 3% growth today when we were able to do that just in 2004? Does the media and Democrats have that little confidence in this generation of Americans? And I've pointed this out before, but I'll point it out again because I do think it's this important. Over 25 years, if you grow your economy at 3% instead of 2%, which may seem small, but over 25 years, that means every single citizen is making $20,000 more per year. That it significantly reduces poverty, that significantly raises living standards, and that's why getting economic growth back to its 3% level, which is where we were just back in 2004, is so critical to helping the middle class get out of this stagnation and begin again feeling that it can achieve the American dream. So I think you have to push back on these naysayers who are saying 3% is not achievable. That's historically what we have achieved, and it's just of late under the Obama years when we stopped achieving that. So really want to push back hard on that, and don't buy this thing, this America doubting you can't do 3%. We've been doing it all of our country's history. It's up to those who say we can't to make a much more cogent argument as to why we can't. Third, switching overseas, where Trump is now beginning, I think, would actually be the more difficult part of his overseas journey in Europe. Two things I want to focus on there. In the G7 beginning today, expect them to push him hard on a resolution of the Paris climate change deal, where I think you'll see him make an announcement one way or the other next week. The rumor is he's personally opposed to the deal and will pull out. I hope he does, because ultimately this deal is unenforceable. So what's going to happen is we're going to be making cuts that hurt our manufacturers, whereas China won't go through with its cuts and won't face any punishment. Just yesterday, Moody's downgraded China's creditworthiness, saying their potential growth is slower. So do you really think China is going to enact regulations that slow its manufacturing base when it's already facing secular pressures? No, they're not going to do what they promised to do. We're going to do it, and we'll be the suckers again who just make our own industries less and less competitive. So expect the Europeans to push him to stick to the climate deal, but hopefully next week he sticks to his campaign promise and pulls out. And then you have NATO meeting right after the G7. NATO will be joining the ISIS fight. That's really just symbolic because all of the member nations of NATO are already in the coalition, so that's more of a formality. The key thing is whether or not you can get firm commitments from more countries to hit their mandated 2% defense spending requirements, because you can't have freeloaders. And that's really, I think, how you judge the success of the European leg of the trip. The Middle Eastern leg was successful because he's getting the Gulf states to begin form an anti-Iran coalition, and they are spending for their own defense. Can we get the same from Europe? And given the horrible, evil terrorist attack in Manchester, that needs to be a wake-up call for the Europeans that they need to start pulling their own weight, and that NATO is a joint security pact, which means each member needs to provide some security. So that's what I would look for there. Finally, just quickly, in the search for the FBI director, it appears that Joe Lieberman is no longer under consideration, given, I think, some hesitation to put a politician in the job. I think the fact that you have a special prosecutor and Bob Mueller there has kind of eased off the rush to get into FBI director, so they probably lengthen the search a little bit. I'd again push for saying that he should go with the New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, whose unimpeachable integrity is independent, is a career in law enforcement, well respected, and importantly knows the terrorist threat. And as the events of this past week have shown, terrorism is still the top threat in this country. It's important for the FBI to have a tough on terror director, and that's exactly what Ray Kelly would be. So I really hope that that's who Trump can convince to take the job. So those are the top 4 stories of the day. As always, hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did or didn't, please provide comments below on how we can make it better, and any other thoughts you have. Please subscribe to the channel so that you know the next time we release a video. You can also follow us on Facebook at the Listen and Learn Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Read and Learn. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.